Hello and welcome back everyone, we Weeb Online, and today I'm gonna continue the story What If Naruto Mastered How to Edit Seals Part 17. If you enjoy this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
When you were stuck in a cave with nothing to do, you didn't realize how long a day was until you had nothing to do. She had 3 days to figure that out. She gave a quiet huff, which her teamster was the only one who heard, and tried to move her position against the cave wall, using her pack as a sort of pillow. Even so, it wasn't a very good pillow, and the thin pack had metal plates on it to protect the scrolls it was made to hold. A long time ago, envoys used these kinds of bags to carry important letters and secret information. The Uzumaki used them for something different, but still similar. Why stop with just papers when you can put seals on those papers? Even better, those papers and seals could hold not only an arsenal but also a lot of other sealed papers. The fact that these papers exploded into big fireballs was just a bonus, and no one had ever cared about making the outside comfortable. This was more clear than ever as she tried again to find a position that was even a little bit comfortable. She wasn't getting anywhere at all. She gave up with a loud huff, yanked the pack off her back, and threw it to her side with more force than was necessary, crossing her arms in irritation. A few years ago, she might have done it too, but she was lucky to have grown out of it before she went back to Konoha. Since she didn't have anything else to do, she looked at the only things in the cave that were even a little bit interesting. And that was being generous. At least that's what she thought. As you might expect, Sakura was on her knees next to Sasuke, even though they couldn't help him anymore at the moment. Based on what Naruto had seen over the last few days, the cold rag on his head didn't need to be changed for another 20 minutes, and he hadn't done anything more than wrinkle his brow or mumble slightly in his sleep. If you asked her to be honest, she would say it sounds like whimpering, but she could at least try to be a little nicer to her teammate. Even so, when he was hurt, also, they didn't even know who had attacked them, let alone what was wrong with their teammate. After 6 hours of doing nothing in this god-forsaken cave, she decided that it wasn't her place to judge his current state or any mumbles or whimpers that came out of him. If it was something she knew, though, that would be a whole different story. Still, the fact that he was crying was a cause for concern. Even when he was out cold and couldn't hide anything, he always seemed to be able to handle pain better than the other genin of their year. He wasn't as good at hiding the results of failed fire jutsu as he might have thought, and she knew he would keep training or doing whatever lame mission Kakashi gave them to keep them busy and out of his hair even if he failed to hide the results. So, every time he whimpered, she couldn't help but want to know what was wrong with him. There wasn't much else to do in here besides think at the moment. She thought she could try talking to Sakura, but neither of them really seemed to want to talk. That turned out to be a good thing, because if they had been talking, she might have missed the sound of the leaves moving between her team and the rest of the exam. She did hear it, though, and knew right away that they had guests. For a forest of death, there wasn't much death there. There were some strange animals they had come across, but they weren't even worth killing as they ran away from the more dangerous predator. Even though Shukaku wasn't the strongest Biju, and this wasn't his territory, the animals still knew how dangerous he was. Well, that was the problem with his container, but to these animals, there was no difference between Jinchuriki and Biju. There was only the hunter and the hunted. Gaara was the hunter, so the forest did what it should have done. Even though it was a little strange, it was helpful for his siblings. Knowing that your little brother was a bloodthirsty killer with a giant tanuki sealed inside him was one thing. Seeing giant spiders and insects twice as tall as a grown man run away when he came near was something else entirely. At the very least, it showed how stupid it was for humans to make these Jinchuriki and then let them live among them. The fact that many Jinchuriki were tortured by the people who made them was even better. The animals in this forest were smarter than that. One could also say that they managed to stay alive after Gaara died. Villagers who didn't have the same instincts but still thought it would be a good idea to show in some way that they didn't like his presence couldn't say the same. Even though the forest was doing its best to stay out of his way, and most of the teams weren't able to put up even the slightest of challenges. They could have finished this test on the first day, probably within a few hours, but they still wandered around. Gaara did it not because he didn't have enough scrolls, since he had already met that goal, but because he wanted to. He hadn't said anything else about it. His siblings hadn't been brave enough to ask, so they kept going through the most famous training ground in Konohagakure no Sato, almost without a plan. Each of them had their own pair of scrolls. Gaara's were given to his sister so he wouldn't have to carry them himself, and Kankuro used chakra strings to play with 3 more scrolls. He looked amused, and Gaara didn't care as long as the older boy was behind him, where he didn't have to watch him, and they didn't lose any of those scrolls. They might not be needed, but Gaara got them, and he wasn't going to let his work, no matter how easy it was for him, go to waste. Gaara honestly didn't know why he didn't just go to the tower and stop. He couldn't have found anything here, right? At the same time, he couldn't help but wonder if that girl, who was Naruto-sama's sister, had already finished the task and was at the tower. So, going back would give him a chance to watch her, and if she was anything like her brother, she probably did even better on this test than he had so far. Still, the fact that her brother was a god didn't say anything about her. She might still be out here for all he knew, and he didn't know what he would do if he ran into her team. On the one hand, it would be a chance to see how skilled she was in, if that wasn't enough, to crush her before she got close to her brother's huge strength. Getting rid of her now, while they were hiding in the forest, was a safe plan. On the other hand, it gave them a chance to turn things around. At first, it was only hers, but it could have been Naruto-sama's at the same time. That showed Naruto-sama right away that he didn't want to fight him, at least not right now. And it might lead him to figure out how Naruto-sama got his power in the long run. Or, at the very least, the possibility of finding a weakness. It was a bit riskier than just killing her, but he had a better chance of hiding his part in her death, and Gaara didn't know how they were related, so he couldn't predict Naruto-sama's reaction. But the chance to get close to Naruto-sama in a way that would make it less likely that the same god-given flesh would wipe him out. And Gaara really wanted to live, damn it. Then, it was an ally. It was alright. Stabbing someone in the back was easier anyway, so he had been told. He hadn't worked with steel in a long time. In fact, if he remembered right, the last person he tried to use steel against was probably himself. He might have done better if he had stabbed himself in the back. Before he could think about that much or tell Kankuro to stab himself in the back, he smelled something familiar. He thought it had been there for at least 3 days, but the smell was so faint that he could recognize it anywhere. Blood. It was the same deep growl they were used to hearing, but it was said so quietly they almost didn't hear it. Almost. They were still very afraid of the boy and would never have been so careless as to miss him talking. That would be just asking to get hurt. Even if it wasn't on purpose, Gaara wasn't used to being ignored. Still, it was strange that he spoke at such a low volume. Even Kankuro was smart enough to figure out that his brother wanted them to be quiet. Gaara moved close to the smell without making a sound, which Temari hadn't noticed before and made her nervously shiver. He found the smell in some nearby bushes. A quick check with strands of sand showed that there were no dead bodies, human or otherwise. Gaara could only think that the smell came from beyond the wall. He walked through the trees without thinking and without trying to be quiet. His siblings followed him quickly. Even though Kankuro first thought his brother was going to walk straight into the hill, there was a cave behind them that was pretty well lit even though there was no fire. A slight breeze could be felt, and it was the same breeze that carried the smell of dried blood. This meant that there were other places where light could get into the cave. The smell probably came from the still body, which was usually pink. Of course, that pink was very different, and Gaara was already interested in this group. Pink female, raven male. There, off to the side, was Naruto-sama's sister, a bright blonde. Maybe by blood, maybe not, but either way, it was a chance to get the favor he needed so badly. But knowing how to curry favor and having the chance to do so were very different from being diplomatic. He made a lazy gesture toward the downed Uchiha, which was really just an attempt to avoid making a move that would look too hostile. He wasn't completely hopeless, though. He then asked a question with all the tact he had learned since meeting Naruto-sama and realizing he wasn't the top of the food chain. Is he really dead? Most likely not, since the body was being cared for in the middle of camp instead of by the far wall. But who knew what weird habits the Leaf Nin had? The blonde's face went from looking surprised and cautious to almost angry, as if she couldn't believe he had asked her that of all things. Fairly, neither could his brothers and sisters. No, he's not dead. She crossed her arms over her chest and gave a quiet huff from where she was sitting. She probably should be more scared about being found. But a question like that didn't make her feel like she was in danger. Gaara said, "Oh." Then she was quiet for a moment as she watched the pink Kunoichi continue to fuss after her charge. "Kankuro, it's up to you to carry him." "What? Why me?" The first thing that worried him was that he was supposed to do something, not what it was that he was supposed to do. When it came to Gaara, you quickly learned not to ask him what he wanted you to do. Who had to do it was a whole other story. Gaara didn't bother to explain. With just one look, his older brother walked over to the only male genin on Team 7. With a flick of the puppeteer's fingers, the puppeteer's favorite weapon came untangled from his back and was used as a makeshift stretcher, which was a very low-class thing to do. When used correctly with a joint frame, chakra strings had a surprising amount of power. When Sakura saw that someone was trying to move her Uchiha, she tried to stop them, but the older Sunanin gave her a quick look, and Sakura stepped back to let the puppet pick up her teammate. It made Kenkuro feel better, which was a bonus. Gaara might be able to get him to back down with a look, but at least he was better than these new genin. Gaara turned to leave the cave once Sasuke was safe. He didn't pay any attention to Sasuke's two Uchiha teammates as they rushed to get their things together and follow their injured teammate. The two Kunoichi on Team 7 didn't know why their Suna opponents were helping them, but when Temari gave up her own pair of scrolls, they didn't care much. They needed to get out of this damn forest and into a nice hot bath as soon as possible. So, he said, breaking the comfortable silence as they sat back down on his couch and did little more than enjoy being together. What was it exactly that you were doing? Orochimaru, who was resting her head on his shoulder, lifted it to meet his gaze with a questioning brow. We both know that after my wolves snuck you in, you didn't come right here. Then. The many papers on the coffee table and the fact that her answer showed she had been busy more recently were completely ignored. He had a sneaking suspicion that the wolves had told Mai that he had finished his paperwork and that she had given him some of her own, which, even though it was a little annoying, was more than fair. After all, it had been his work. If the person he gave the job to had too much on her plate, he had to do it himself. Well, that or find someone else for administrative tasks. At first, Mai had been like a secretary, but now that she had more responsibilities, it might be time for a new one. He had to wonder if it would be easier to just do the job himself than to find someone else to do it. He didn't believe it. Then yes, he said, and there was a hint of humor in his voice. He still couldn't get over the fact that the woman curled up next to him on the couch, her bare feet tucked under a pillow to keep them warm, was the S-rank Rouge Shinobi who could give Jounin nightmares. Even when they weren't using other people's bodies, they were never seen as completely normal. Definitely brilliant, but I've never thought of him as anything but a little bit off. Just delivering a gift, she said. If he hadn't been able to feel her move against him, he wouldn't have been able to hear her faint shrug. Don't worry, nobody died. She thought for a moment. I didn't kill anyone, at least not directly. They might have died anyway, was her final answer, even though she wasn't asked for more details. And who was it that may have died? Oh, the Uchiha. He should be fine. I think he's strong enough to survive my 10 no Juin. Whether or not something else will kill him while his body adjusts to it, though. She shrugged again. Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Is there a reason you went after him? He didn't care much one way or the other, but he was still curious. Naruto had Mito, and he was sure that even if the Uchiha was useless, Mito would be able to save the team. Mito wouldn't have been happy with anything else. Still, he was interested. She must have had a reason for going after him, right? But this was also Orochimaru. She was the kind of person who would do something just because she could. My goal is to learn every jutsu that has ever existed, exists now, or will exist in the future, she said. He paused. The Sharingan. And how, exactly, will possibly killing him get you his eyes? It couldn't be that hard for someone of her caliber to just pluck them out. The Sannin began, seals are amazing, but I'm nowhere near as good as your father. I helped him with the small parts, like individual seal strands that were small parts of the whole, and was there for him to bounce ideas off of while he made the masterpiece on your arm. She looked longingly at his arm because she knew what was under the white cloth and how much it could mean. Even so, I was able to make something of my own. It wasn't the work of a true master, but by adding other things, I was able to make a seal that made anyone who wore it stronger in battle, she said. The biggest problem is that not everyone is strong enough to handle such drastic changes to their body. The first time the seal is placed is the most dangerous because it creates a second chakra system in the user's body that can be used when they are under a lot of stress. She only took a short break, as if to decide how much he really cared to know, and then she went on to explain. Stress, on the other hand, is hard to measure in the shinobi world, at least when it comes to fighting. Anger, on the other hand, was a much easier trigger and would allow the seal to give more power with little to no input from the user. The extra power dulls some of the senses and makes people more aggressive, but to a well-trained shinobi, these are small problems compared to the power boost it gives. So you decided to give it to a genin. I don't understand how that's smart, Orochimaru. Because I don't want him to keep it, she said, trying not to notice the shiver that went through her when she heard him say her name. Something about the way he said it made her want to. No, she had to pay attention. She could give that some thought later. At his current level, it would take him years of training to master it, but it gives him an immediate boost that beats most genin. Opponents can't really take advantage of the increased aggression and decreased senses until they reach the upper B ranks. Not really getting it, said the young lord. If I can make him stronger than his peers with just one bite, how much power can he get if he leaves the village to train with me? He raised his eyebrows and looked down at her. That seems like a very complicated way to get a genin to leave his village. If you just wanted him out of Konoha, you could just promise him power in the future, show him a unique jutsu, or grab him while he's sleeping. It shouldn't be hard for you to kidnap him. She felt another chill run down her spine. Oh, she would love to get close to a certain genin, but not the Uchiha. But it's not just about getting him away. If I just took his eyes, they would only last for one of my bodies. It was easy to forget that this wasn't Orochimaru's original body, and that she planned to take more in the future. When he thought about it, though, doesn't the seal have something to do with the fact that you can change bodies? She smiled at him in a big way. Right? The same extra chakra system that gives the user a boost also lets me store my own chakra in them and slowly get their body used to my presence. It's much easier to take over when the body accepts me, even if the person doesn't. So you've marked the Uchiha to get his Sharingan. Do I even want to know how it's going to carry over to future bodies? She shrugged again and said, it's not too bad. When I bite them, I leave both the seal and traces of my current genetic makeup, which the seal uses to change the body as it takes over the host. When I next perform the transfer, my newest body's genetic makeup is added to the mix. At least, that's the simple version. It took me a long time to find a way to only pass on desirable genetic traits. It's not perfect, but it's pretty goddamn good, if I do say so myself. Oh, I see. How long until you take his body? I don't think you'll have to wait too long for the body to be ready, or too many bad things could happen. A week, give or take a few days, if I have them in a controlled environment. If I just put the seal on someone at random and they survived, it can take up to 6 weeks. Knowing that the Uchiha will definitely use the seal's power whenever he can, I'd give him maybe 2 weeks. So you'll be in his body by the time of the invasion. Orochimaru turned her head down. Oh no, I won't try that for a few months. I just wanted to make sure he was marked now while I had the chance. Does it matter? She paused, feeling a momentary panic. You weren't planning anything for him, were you? She could tell she was forgetting something. This was Naruto's territory, and she should have checked before she did anything. But, given how calm he had been so far, that didn't seem like a problem. Even if it turned out that he had plans for the boy, but they weren't important enough for her to care about losing them, she would feel terrible about ruining them. No, it was a short, to-the-point answer, and silence fell between them again. It wasn't around for very long. Actually, he said to start talking again. I keep meaning to look into this, but do you know what his relationship to Uchiha Mikoto is? Even though they had been out of the village for a long time. He didn't think the Snake Sannin would know, but hearing about the Uchiha reminded him that he still hadn't taken the time to find out. He had decided a long time ago that it wouldn't make much of a difference because she was already his, but it would still be good to know if he wanted to avoid problems in the future. Orochimaru gave him a look. She didn't give him a blank look like she didn't know, but she also didn't seem to believe he was asking that question. She asked, "You're kidding, right? Everyone knows that Sasuke, the youngest son of Fugaku, was the only one to survive that night." His blank face made it clear he wasn't putting together an answer from that. Fugaku was the head of the Uchiha clan, and Mikoto was the head of the family. Oh, his mother then, she said. There was a moment of silence. Oh, well. The Sannin looked at him and blinked. What, you didn't make her promise to protect him or anything else before she died, did you? He raised one eyebrow and moved the corner of his mouth. No, because mostly she's not dead. The look of shock on her face was so cute. Tell me, Orochimaru, have you ever heard of Akatsuki? On the other hand, her next smile was almost enough to make the Shinigami throw up. And here they are, the last lineup for the last exam. The purple examiner's voice was way too happy for someone who had just seen teens beat the crap out of each other for the chance to do the same thing in front of an audience a month later. Still, Mitarashi Enko was here. Even the foreign shinobi knew to expect this, even though they had only seen her twice before she pushed them into a forest and said she hoped they would die there. Of course, that one act was more than enough to tell someone who had never met Mitarashi Enko about her. Lazy Ass Nara versus Dasumami Bugboy versus the Uchiha Eyebrows versus Mr. Fate Sunshine versus a proper fucking fangirl. And the raccoon got lucky and drew number 1, so he skips the first round. Don't ask about the order yet, I'll figure it out based on how big the betting pools are. Any questions? Raccoon put his hand up. Yes, you. The one who must steal his sister's mascara. Kankuro laughed, but he quickly stopped. Mascara is more masculine than lipstick, puppet boy, and at least he has the decency to wear it right. Gaara went on as if they hadn't been interrupted, and only a small smirk showed that he found the whole thing funny. When Temari saw it, he was very scared. If we don't have enough for my match, I could always fight someone else. At least that hadn't changed. Oh, Anko slightly leaned forward and put her hands on her hips. And who would you fight? Maybe me, the little guy. Gaara's laugh was kind enough to be taken as his answer. At any rate, kindly for Anko. What, am I not good enough for you? There's someone else you'd rather spend your time with? Huh. She crossed her arms over her chest and turned one hip to the side. Well, then, tell me, who would you rather fight? Naruto-sama. Anko was already happy when he heard his name, but that made him even happier. Many of the others, on the other hand, were just confused, especially when Naruto's shocked look and Sasuke's deep groan came at the same time. Even though Kakashi wasn't there, Naruto's brother was still able to catch them. He hadn't even seen his Konoha genin friends since they graduated. Admitted to Tokubetsu Jounin. Oh, well, I guess I can't really argue against that one. I'd rather spend time with him than with any of you brats any day. The last Uchiha gave out another groan. Even one Kakashi was bad enough, but two. At this rate, they might as well start a cult for the red-haired young man. He thought that the High no Kuni summer was different, but not all bad, compared to his home country, which would soon have a very humid season because of the moisture from the ocean and the hot winds that would blow all the way from Sunagakure. It was nice and dry here, with a breeze that kept the heat from being too much. Even though it was blowing toward Mizuno Kuni, he wasn't there and could worry about it later. Having lived in one of the lands that was also affected by the heat that made summer in the land of water, he was now going to dislike warm seasons a lot. He always had the bad luck to be stuck in Mizuno Kuni during the summer, but he could take some comfort in the fact that other countries had to deal with the heat before them and didn't have the benefit of being surrounded by so much water. In the end, it seemed like that was a good thing. He'd rather have this hot and dry summer than the warm and humid one in Mizuno Kuni. He wondered if it was as nice in the city as it had been in the countryside of High no Kuni, where the walls of Konoha were tall, and wide gates were open to welcome everyone. This was strange, since Konoha was supposed to be a hidden village. Even though the Land of Fire had a lot of thick forests, the heat wasn't too bad because there was a lot of wind. Would it be the same inside, or would the village's walls turn it into an oven? It's an interesting thought, almost as interesting as realizing that Kirigakure no Sato is the only village that really hides these days. It also seemed to be the only village with big problems, though Suna's economy was said to be close behind. If they had been able to get rid of Yagura, they might have been more open as a village. Allies would have been very helpful at the start of the Blood Limit Rebellion, and they might have stopped the purges from happening in the first place. When no one could see what you were doing, it was much easier to get away with things. Shaking the thought out of his head, he wouldn't have to worry about it until they won, which seemed like a long way off. He kept walking toward the huge gates of Konohagakure. Zabuza said that Mei had a good reason to think that the wolves were at least around Konoha and High no Kuni, if not involved. He heard this in the towns he passed through on his way here, so he knew it was true. This meant that Konoha was his best chance of getting in touch with the Land of Fire's newest noble house. Back in his day, someone in this situation would have gone to the capital and asked the courts for help, or at least asked for a meeting with the noble house they wanted to back. However, during his part in the rebellion, he had learned one very important lesson that had helped him. Mei's wish came true, and what if she told him to look for them in Konoha? So, he had no right to argue. After all, it was her rebellion and her friendship. Just like in the old days, he was a simple soldier who did what he was told, as it ought to be. She was tired, hurt, and dirty, and by the gods, all she wanted was a long, hot bath, some good food, and a lot of time to get back to her favorite bed. That was still a long way off, though. After all that time in the forest of death, she would love nothing more than to just run home. But it seems there were steps that had to be taken first. Debriefings with different chunin for the record, medical exams to make sure they were fit for duty and didn't have an injury that would get worse if it wasn't treated, and a small pile of paperwork that didn't make much sense. It looks like the chunin who brought the papers in for her didn't know what they were for either, just like the chunin who brought him his papers years ago. No one seemed to know what the point was, and none of them were willing to look through the rules and laws of Konoha to find out. It was much easier to just have each genin take care of the paperwork after the exam. She would usually agree if she hadn't had to go through it herself. Other parts of this business after the exam had been easy, if you didn't mind that she had left out some details from the forest. But the paperwork seemed to take forever. Not that it would be a problem if Sakura's story was compared to hers and the girl had remembered everything. She didn't think it would, since it might make Sasuke look bad, and Sasuke wouldn't include it for the same reason. Still, there were other things that didn't make sense that could make people doubt her team. They didn't really need to know that Sasuke was bitten by an infiltrator who was much stronger than a Chunin and then woke up on Kenkuro's puppet with strange tattoos and corrupted chakra coming from him like some kind of pseudo-Jinchuriki. No, she'd rather keep that part quiet until they knew a little more about what was going on. She still felt sorry for the puppeteer. Poor guy's teammate completely destroyed his puppet as soon as he woke up, so he lost his best asset during the preliminary rounds. Lee's youth was better than his, even though he didn't have a puppet. He had been beaten pretty badly. On the plus side, though, the destruction of Karasu, as she had learned the puppet's name was enough to get Gaara's attention, and a quick wall of sand was able to knock out the Uchiha long enough for the chakra to drain from his strange seal and his normal mind to return. She had trained with that kind of power for years, so she knew all too well how blinding it could be before you got used to such a rush of pure power. Still, she didn't want to deal with it, especially when it came from her teammate and when they were in the middle of an exam that could cost them their lives. Even more so, she was thankful that the Suna team had found them and helped. She just needs to figure out why. Well, fuck. He had hoped that would work, but it hadn't in any way. Even though his student had been marked by what could only be Orochimaru's Ten no Juin, which might help the boy's chances of making it as a shinobi more than hurt him. Nothing bad had really happened to the group so far. The only good thing was that two of them had a small chance of becoming Chunin in the last exam, which would free him from them. Then, of course, he might have to take Sakura on as an apprentice. That didn't sound like any kind of fun. He really hoped he wasn't seeing the whole picture and how he was really going to benefit from what was going on around him. After all, he was Hadake fucking Kakashi, and being him was supposed to be good. It's okay if they stay, Naruto-kun, right? The voice came from another room as they stood in the living room of a Konoha apartment. Dasu had to admit that he had not planned on being in this situation, not least because a female Orochimaru was in the other room trying to convince this Naruto-kun. And it was weird enough to hear Orochimaru call someone that with real affection, to let him and his team stay with them during the month break between the second and third exams. Technically, he was the only one who needed a place to sleep, since his teammates had lost in the preliminary exams and were no longer eligible to become Chunin through this exam. Neither of them was really ready for such a role, and even he would admit that he didn't have all the skills needed to do it, even though he was able to. Yes to mind, but no to power. They were both very important. Still, as long as one of them was still taking the test, the whole team was allowed to stay in the village that was hosting them. Something about building goodwill by letting future Chunin, who are the strongest shinobi in each village, visit other villages. It seemed like Orochimaru wanted them all to stay, so he wasn't going to argue against it. If nothing else, it would have been nice to have friends close by. That's not to say that the wolf-masked shinobi guarding the front door, the kitchen window, and the door to the room Orochimaru was in weren't allies, because they were, but he was much more likely to trust those he had fought and trained with. Accepting the wolves as allies was one thing, but to feel safe with them just because the Snake Sannin said so was another. That was something else. A voice replied to his master, but it was so soft that only a murmur could be heard through the walls. It still felt strange to call Orochimaru mistress, and he wasn't going to call her that until she made him. The sound of happiness, which he tried hard not to think of as a squeal, told him that at least the response had been positive. He gave Kin, who he liked to think of as his favorite minion, a look to show that she was listening to the conversation as best she could. A quick look at Zaku, who was lying carelessly on their host's couch before they even met the man, showed that he had clearly not been. The punk looked like he was almost asleep. Even if the forest was hard, he could probably keep up appearances for another hour. If Orochimaru liked this person, he shouldn't have done anything to make her mad in the first place. That had nothing to do with how their host might respond. Orochimaru liked them, as we've already said. Dasu usually didn't think about the kinds of people who could win her favor. An hour, on the other hand, would be enough time to meet everyone and get settled. At that point, they could claim to be tired and go home for the rest of the day, or at least for a few hours to get their energy back before dinner. The wolf's movement at the door caught his eye, and he and Kin jumped into a ready position that was alert enough to be polite but relaxed enough to feel natural. He didn't try to persuade Zaku to stand up out of respect for their master and her favorite, but Kin was kind enough to hiss Zaku at him. His sleepy ha was ignored by his teammates, who kept their eyes on the opening door and aimed as best they could for what would be right over Orochimaru's shoulders when she walked back out. Small changes could be missed, but it wouldn't do to look like they weren't listening to the woman. Some of the recruits had found out the hard way that there was a thin line between paying attention to her and making her mad by staring at her. She wanted you to know who she was, but that didn't mean she liked being watched while she went about her business. Also, there was that fool who had the nerve to look her right in the eyes when she was getting close. Whether it was meant to be aggressive or defiant didn't matter. In a matter of seconds, his head was rolling across the stone floors of Otagakure. Dasu was very determined not to have the same thing happen to him. Soon, Orochimaru came out of the room, joined them, and gave Zaku a poisonous look. He moved quickly to get into a good, if messy, position. The Chunin candidate who was bandaged up thought that Zaku was still alive because it would have been rude to kill him in their host's house. Bloodstains were really hard to get rid of. His attention moved from Zaku's good luck, no matter how short-lived it was, to a new figure moving in the doorway. The first thing he noticed was that the hair was a deep red that almost looked like it was on fire in the light that came in through the living room's almost closed blinds. Second was, of course, the height. Even if he stopped hunching over, they might be a little taller than him, but unless their host was really, really short, they couldn't be much older than him. Even though the person had a noble face, it looked like they were even younger than him. If you were kind and said they just looked young, Dasu would only think he was maybe 2 or 3 years older than him. He thought that was still pretty young. What the hell was he doing to get not only Orochimaru's attention but also her favor? It was said that the last person close to that was her right hand, who was a spy here in Konoha until he was sent to Wave to help set up a new outpost. If this person was about the same level as Orochimaru's right hand, he didn't want to get in trouble with them. After making his observations, he quickly wrote down that the person had pale skin that looked almost alien in the light, and bright purple eyes that he was sure could see right through him. This, Orochimaru said to start off, is the one who has kindly agreed to host us for the next month. I expect you all to be on your best behavior for Naruto-kun here. I don't want to hear that you've managed to upset my Crimson Prince. Crimson Prince, indeed. Dasu didn't think it would be hard to convince him that Orochimaru's favorite was Amaterasu or, more likely, her child. No matter what, their looks set them apart from most people in a way that almost said they were gods and, more importantly, powerful. If Orochimaru was interested in anything before, it was power, and their host's appearance just screamed it. What kind of power it was would have to be worked out later, but it was clear that it was there. He didn't say what he was thinking, but he was quick to answer his master, kin close behind. Of course, Orochimaru-sama, he said, and he gave a shallow bow, even though he was already slightly bent over. What you say will happen. Yes, Orochimaru-sama. Orochimaru gave him a happy smile when he gave an extra bow to their host, this Naruto, which she quickly lost when she turned to look at Zaku. Yeah, we'll be good, boss. Zaku was an idiot who was going to die because he wasn't paying attention and acting in the right way. As if Orochimaru's frown wasn't bad enough, Naruto's lips pulled down slightly as he looked at his new guest. Dasu wouldn't blame him if he changed his mind about being their host. Of course, Dasu knew more about what that frown could mean. Orochimaru might have wanted to kill Zaku, and it was more likely than not that she did. But she didn't because it would have been rude and might have upset Naruto even more. As their host, Naruto didn't have the same problem. If he didn't care about the bloodstains, he could get rid of them himself or have someone else do it. Then again, it was probably also rude to kill one's guests. I'd better not regret this, Orochimaru. The way he talked to their master almost gave the Oto Nin a heart attack. The words came out so naturally, but the vague threat of friends doing things they didn't want to do alone would make it seem like he thought he was better than her. Worse still, the way she answered made it sound like she might be. She quickly crept up to him and wrapped her arms around him, making sure to press his head between her breasts. Oh, don't worry, Naruto-kun. We'll be good for you, and if any of them upset you, I'll make it up to you. She said the last part in a way that was so seductive that Dasu was afraid to admit it. And had what Orochimaru said meant that she was going to stay with them. Had she been living with this young man here before? If the way they looked at each other was any indication, Kin seemed to be feeling the same way, and he had to ask himself once more, who the hell were they staying with? People called him lazy, and they weren't wrong, but don't say that Sarutobi Asuma did anything halfway. If he had to do something, you could bet on the fact that he would do it right, even if he'd rather be doing almost anything else than sitting in the Hokage's office and learning about the job he'd soon be doing. He had thought more than once about whether he could turn down the job and how he would do it. There had only ever been 4 Kage of Konoha, and they all wanted to be in charge. Only Uzashigakure had been around longer, and the Uzumaki clan's Kages had been the royal family, with each one taking the position like it was their rightful crown. So there's not a whole lot to say about why he turned down the chance to lead the village. Even though he wanted to help the village, he didn't want the stress and responsibility that came with the job. The time he spent in the 12 Guardian Shinobi with the daimyo, and in the Imperial Fire Court was enough politics for him to last a lifetime. He would much rather spend a few years training a team and then spend the rest of his life as the head of the Sarutobi clan, which is a much less stressful job. He was already acting as clan leader, and that work wasn't too hard. If you took away his responsibilities as a team leader, it would be a piece of cake. He just couldn't wait. Or, more accurately, he couldn't wait. Now, that future seemed further and further away with every paper he had to read and signature he had to scrawl in fine ink when he shouldn't have. Still, if he had to do this, even though he didn't want to, he was going to do everything to the best of his ability. Already, groups of NBU agents were searching the streets for signs of Orochimaru, whom Tokubetsu Jounin Mitarashi Anko was said to have seen in the Forest of Death. The fact that Uchiha Sasuke used a strange seal that gave off bad chakra during the preliminary rounds pointed to the Ten-no Juin Mitarashi was left with years ago, which she seems to have been able to get rid of. It was a sign of hope, but Orochimaru had probably been making changes to it, and the seals of Anko and Sasuke were probably not the same. Still, knowing how she took hers off might help her figure out how to take Sasuke's off, which needed to be done quickly. Besides Orochimaru, who seemed to be staying out of the way, and Sasuke's curse seal, Asuma was going to have to put a lot of effort into something else. The wolf pack. His father had not been very open with information and had only promised to give it to him after the inauguration, whenever that was, because he thought it was too sensitive to give out before then. Don't worry about the fact that he was sitting here reading ANBU reports and agreeing to missions that the rest of the world wouldn't know about. Hiruzen was getting old, even if he was wise and strong, not only in years, but also in spirit. He was the first Hokage who wasn't one of the village's founders. He had lived in the village for a long time and seen a lot as they built and protected their own safe place in what had been a war-torn land only a few decades before. Asuma was sure that his father had grown tired of his job before his first retirement. He had never seen his father happier than when he was finally freed from the responsibility of running the village after many years of hard work, and by the time he took it up again, he had already lost the drive he had when he first became Hokage. He cared about the village and did his best for it, but now he didn't seem to be able to see the bigger picture, and it was almost impossible for him to separate his own feelings from what should be done and what needs to be done. The former Guardian 12 member didn't have anything against the wolves themselves. In fact, the way things were going, it looked like the wolves might be the equivalent of root for his own time as cage. He didn't like it, but he knew it was necessary. However, he couldn't give them so much freedom in the village. He had never been interested in politics before, but the thought of having to deal with clan politics, village law, the will of Hi-no Kuni's Imperial Fire Court, and the pack mentality of a hidden force that sat in the shadows of Konoha's great tree was giving him a major headache. It was simply impossible, and the only way it could have been done was if they were all set up in a way that kept a balance between them and made it possible to negotiate and find a middle ground whenever one group wanted something. That would be hard enough, but he had another problem there that would be easy to fix. He knew the Fire Court pretty well. From his time as acting head of the Sarutobi clan, he knew enough about how the clans in Konoha got along. Preparing to be Hokage gave him a lot of time to learn about the rules of the village. He was pretty sure that he wouldn't have too much trouble keeping these three things happy. But he didn't know very much about the wolves. That would need to be different. Anyone from the Yamanaka clan would be way too obvious, but they weren't his only choice. Now he had to figure out how to get them to work with him. When I took a deep breath of the warm, moist air, it made me think of the past. Lots and lots of memories. Most of them left him in pain and making his way to the hospital. When Tsunade worked there, those usually turned into painful trips to the hospital. With all the time she had spent in the area, she could tell right away when injuries came from women who didn't like being watched in the hot springs. He usually left in more pain than when he arrived, but at least she would treat his wounds and, more often than he liked to admit, set the bones that angry Kunoichi had broken. It was amazing that he hadn't been castrated yet. Still, the fact that the luck that had kept him from experiencing anything so far was likely to run out eventually had never kept Konoha's gallant Jiraiya away from the hot springs or the beautiful women who relaxed there. Whether a hot spring was foreign or local, Jiraiya had probably been there and been kicked out of it, sometimes by the boss, but more often by a group of angry women. Oh, it was fun. Even though some happy memories ended badly, there was no hot spring like the one in Konoha. Even though it wasn't the biggest or the least likely to get him caught or hurt horribly. In fact, most of his injuries from hot springs happened here. It was special because it was Konoha's. It was my house, and home was a place he hadn't been in a very long time. Truth be told, he hadn't been here in well over a decade, and for almost as long. He had done his best to stay away from everything that happened in the village. He could be reached in an emergency, but even though his personality was nomadic, it was hard for him to be away from home. A few months here or there didn't bother him, but like a big tree, his roots never moved, no matter how far his leaves were blown by the wind. And speaking of being blown around by the wind, Kushina and her daughter had been seen traveling around the continent in the most strange ways. Strangely, not a single report from any of his sources said anything about her son being there. He had tried to find them when he had the chance, but he was usually called away to take care of something in his network before he could catch up. And by the time he was done, he had to start all over again. He wanted to know what was going on, but he had to do his job first. Konoha needed him to be out in the field doing what he was best at, which meant he had to be gone for much longer than he would have liked. That time would have been harder if he had come back, so he focused on his work and stopped thinking about the rest of the world. He had been able to do this for years, knowing that if something big happened while he was away, like a civil war, he would hear about it. It also helped that Konoha didn't need to know anything about Konoha. But gods, it was good to be home. Traveling as Jiraiya was one thing, but he spent most of his time trying to stay out of sight, which was another reason he didn't want to be seen coming and going from Konoha. This way, he could watch potential threats without telling them that the world was aware of them. Akatsuki was one of these groups, and the wolves were another one until recently. Information about Hai no Kuni as a whole was the closest thing he could get to news about Konoha, and he had no idea that the group that had first caught his attention had become a noble house in the Imperial Fire Court. To say the least, it was a surprise. At the same time, though, it had given him a little bit of a break. Since they were friends with Hai no Kuni and seemed to be doing well, there wasn't much chance that they would be mean to the village. At least for now. That didn't mean he had just given up on them and stopped caring about the rest of the world. But they weren't his top priority. Even though they had to work with Gato first to make sure they were completely successful. The fact that they had completely gotten rid of Gato from Wave, and that the port town was starting to get better because of their protection was a good sign. Even so, that was probably also a big part of why the daimyo liked them. Because they had taken over a country, he thought he could technically trust them a little more than other possible threats. At first, he did it to get the daimyo's favor, but that was just the result of the first action. If someone hadn't rudely shouted pervert at him, he might have had time to frown at the thought. Just like old times. The letter was much better than she was used to seeing. It was clear and clean. The glittering ink was written on the heavy paper with the elegant curves of a well-trained wrist, as if giving the letter itself more weight would somehow make the message in it more powerful. Well, Shizune thought. They were right. This might not always work, but the heavy paper she was now holding made the writing seem much more real. She would admit that if the letter looked more ordinary, she would be much less likely to believe what was written. Even though every detail was taken care of, it was still hard to believe that this was really happening. It wasn't even a big deal. Someone was just writing to tell her that they were interested in her medical skills. Not in the usual way, which would be to ask her or, more specifically, her master to go to the home of a friend or family member who was hurt. Instead, the letter made it clear that they wanted to hire her. The last time she got a request on paper like this, it was from a small family of nobles whose heir was very sick. In this case, too, the requester was from a noble house, but instead of just one injury, they wanted to give her a job as a permanent member of the household. If she accepted, she would join this noble house and become the official doctor for the head, or so the letter said. And that was not something to be taken lightly. If she didn't care about her master's safety, she might have been tempted to accept the offer, but there was something else that stopped her. The House of Wolves of the Imperial Fire Court of Hai no Kuni was the place where she would have worked. She was, as you might expect, a little hesitant to join them. They seemed to be ready for that, though. The main offer was for her to fully join them, but they also said they were willing to talk about other ways she could help them. One idea was to train some of their most promising medical staff for 8 months to bring them up to a higher standard. She would have been asked to do this anyway as part of the house, so it didn't sound like such a bad idea. The promised pay looked good, not to mention the bonuses they would give her based on how well she trained their medics and the fact that they would pay for all of her expenses for the duration. It would also give her a chance to get to know Hai no Kuni's newest noble house before she made a long-term commitment. She still had to take care of her master, and even if she didn't, her apprenticeship wouldn't let her teach anyone else until it was over. She looked like she would need to talk to Tsunade about both of these things. Shizune let out a sigh as she put the letter on the table and put her head on her hand. At last, she had a chance to do something new and exciting. But if she had her way, she'd be stuck here, bored to death, like she had been since they got back to Konoha. At least Shizune had things to do while Tsunade was drinking herself to sleep to forget about her past and her responsibilities. Running away from debt collectors, making sure Tsunade ate every once in a while, and causing as little damage as possible to other people wasn't fun, but it gave her something to do. Tsunade would just sit out in the garden, drink tea, and sometimes cry. Even though it was better than what she had been doing before, she still wasn't doing anything to make up for the mistakes she had made, even though she still had the chance to do so here in Konoha, which others didn't. It was sad that they didn't do this, and their return to Konoha had become a joke because of it. Shizune might have felt sorry for her master and the clear pain she was in if she had tried to fix it, but she couldn't even bring herself to do that right now. Not for the first time, she wished she hadn't become the Senin's apprentice. He always thought about the wolves, which wasn't a surprise. He always thought about their future, to be more specific. A big part of that future meant that there had to be wolves, which meant that they had to keep adding to the pack. It was best to train orphan children, like Danzu had done, so they could learn the right skills and get used to the pack mentality of his forces. However, this was not a quick solution. Naruto didn't have enough time to train the second generation of wolves at the moment, so he had to bring more people into the pack so that it could get strong enough to wait the years it would take to bring the new wolves up to the right standard. He wouldn't or couldn't use them until he was sure they could defend themselves just as well as his other operatives. The cubs were valuable and needed to be cared for until they were old enough to take care of the rest of the pack. Already, his agents were looking through the elemental nations for people who could become wolves and bringing them together so they could be trained. Not in Nami no Kuni, of course, because there is already too much focus there, but his godmother was happy to give him an old lab she hasn't been using much lately. It was a little bit old, but his wolves would soon turn it into a proper den. Their future was being made, but they had to be there to see it through. A key piece was missing for both that future and the way they were going to keep their forces together until they got there. Or rather, was or was not there. His purple eyes moved across his desk and landed on the crisp white piece of paper with the answer he had been working on. He hadn't had too much trouble with it, but he also hadn't done most of the work. Even with all of its beautiful complexity, sealing was still a mystery to him. He was, however, beginning to understand how powerful his father's seal really was. With just a thought, he changed a simple storage seal, one of the few for which he could find instructions, into the seal his wolves wore. He put another storage seal next to it and wished for a seal that could make seals from wet ink. The seal was happy to do what he said. The problem of getting new members into the pack was solved by putting the desired seal on the new applicator, which was the last step. Just giving the seal to Sai or one of the high captains would be enough for them to use it on anyone who was going to become a wolf. He would still have to meet with them to give them this new seal, but after that he wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. He lightly traced his work, amazed at how easy it was because of the seal on his arm. The scary thing was that he didn't even need to take those extra steps to make this. With his father's gift, he could have changed the starting seal to the applicator he already had. He couldn't do it because of his own limits, not because of the seals. By separating each part, he was able to focus more on what he wanted the seals to do and avoid mistakes that could cause problems in the future. Now, though, he had made a seal that was only good for one thing. He had no doubts at all that if he used the single seal method, he would get what he wanted. In the end, a problem that had been bothering them for weeks was fixed in a little more than 20 minutes. He should have done this a lot sooner, especially since he had a lot of time on the trip to Hai no Kuni's capital, and it was a shame that he hadn't used his father's gift properly until now. All he had done with it was change the seal of the wolves, change the seal of Hinata, and take the seal off of Anko. That was a terrible waste of such a great tool. When he thought about how he could use it, he was reminded of the many things he still had to do with it. The wolf problem was solved, but he had to get Hinata a seal as soon as he could to break the caged bird seal of the Hyuga. The Hinata no Mikoto cult would fall apart if their goddess could no longer do the thing they thought made her a goddess or at least a personification of fate. After that, he still had to look into Orochimaru's Ten no Jiwen, which was like the one Anko had once carried. Orochimaru had already done a great job on them, and he couldn't help but wonder what he could do to make his own seal even better. It was a nice thought that all of his wolves would have a backup chakra system, and that led him to his next thought, which was about Anko. He would admit that he liked the woman a lot, and so did his wolves. They also liked the Tokubetsu Jounin. She seemed like a good choice to join them, and he was leaning toward making her the first official member of the Wolves. Since he wanted it, it was clear that it couldn't be that easy. She had already shown that she didn't like seals, and he wasn't sure if it was because the person who put it on her had left her in the village or because Orochimaru had probably branded her without her permission. Either way, it made it less likely that she would accept his own seal, which was required for every member of the village. He was also working with Orochimaru, which was something else. That was definitely a lot bigger. She could keep doing what she was doing without the seal, but Orochimaru would affect her whether she was a wolf or not. He would have to make sure that she loved him enough to look past the fact that she hated his godmother. If not, he would have to cut her off from his wolves and the work they did. There were too many things going on for him to forget that she could be a security risk if she wasn't totally on their side. And that's why the woman he'd been thinking about was now being led into his room with a smile, ready to meet her favorite genin. He was being honest when he said he hoped she would stay with him. At Mei's insistence, he had been completely honest with the guards at the front gate about why he was there. Or at least as honest as he could be, given that one of his eyes was a stolen Byakugan from one of the clans that lived in this village. In the Kiri Civil War, he wanted to talk to the wolves on behalf of the Bloodline faction. Shinobi on duty almost made him feel sorry for him with their looks. Still, the wolves soon found out that he wanted to meet him, and he soon found himself in the company of a wolf agent who led him through the village and into the seedier parts, which he hadn't been to in a very long time. There was a short, plain red building waiting for them. It stood out in this part of the village because it was so plain. There were no flashing lights of strange colors coming from the windows, and there were no open doors inviting people to come in. Two heavy black doors stared at anyone who dared to come close. When they got close, the doors opened to reveal a pair of wolves who stood guard. They didn't move as he and his guide walked by, and he couldn't see anything else inside the building until they were almost at the next door. The wolves seemed to care a lot about having their own space. He would have to remember that the first set of doors closed with a strangely soft click just as the next set of doors started to open. He tried to ignore the guards standing in each corner under the glowing torches as he was led down the large staircase. Again, the only thing in this room other than the guards and the torches, into the building itself. He thought for a moment that maybe underground bases were all the rage for secret, or maybe not so secret, originations. He could remember that many of their own bases were bunkers that were also dug deep to hide from view and make it harder for attackers to get in. It usually also meant that there was no way out if something went wrong. When it came to the bloodline resistance, though, things often went wrong. Even though he didn't want anything to do with the man, Zabuza was onto something. There was no reason for so many people to be involved in leading the rebellion, and at least one of them had to be a spy. He thought there were 5, but Zabuza was more likely to say there were 7. The two older shinobi wouldn't let the young and naive CHJR bet just one, so he said 3. It didn't matter at all that CHJR probably didn't want to be a part of it in the first place. Well, at least until Mei hears about it. She looked out for the boy in an odd way, probably because she liked how often he blushed around her. He had no doubt it helped keep her spirits up. He was going to be the first of a whole new generation of swordsmen of the mist, which was also a big deal. But it probably didn't matter as much as how often he made Mei happy. But if anyone asked him why, he would always say it was because of CHJR's status and maybe add that he was one of the young people they were trying to make a better future for. He would have given anything not to be on Mei's bad side. Ever. She had said she would melt balls off before, but it didn't mean much until someone actually saw her do it. He couldn't sleep with his back to the door for weeks. Zabuza, on the other hand, hadn't done any better. She looked at the young man behind the desk with interest as he went through the stacks of papers that filled the desk. One could probably clear out about half of the space he was using if they were stacked together, but it was clear that the way he did it had something to do with organization, which was a skill Anko had never really had. Purple Eyes had only given her a quick glance when she walked in before going back to work. He only stopped to put one piece of parchment away in one of his desk drawers. Either he didn't want to lose it or he didn't want her to see it. Almost certainly both. Really, that didn't bother her at all. Since she worked in the T&I department of Konoha, she knew a lot about sensitive information and how to keep some of it safe. Knowing that he worked closely with the wolves and, based on how they treated him, was a pretty high-up member of the group, made it likely that it had something to do with the mysterious group. If they had given him important, sensitive information, she couldn't blame him for making sure it didn't fall into the hands of people who didn't have the right clearance to see it, or whatever they called letting this kind of information out. She didn't think they were formal enough for set clearances, and they seemed more like a need-to-know operation, but she couldn't be sure because she wasn't part of the group. Naruto started to clean up part of his desk by handing folders of finished work to a wolf who had been waiting patiently by his side for just this reason. This got her out of her thoughts. Before leaving the room, the wolf gave a quick bow and held the folders close to their chest. When the door closed, there were only the two of them and two wolf guards in the room. The young man in front of her leaned back in his chair for a moment, letting out a sigh of relief that he had finished some of his work. He soon straightened up again in his chair, though. As he stopped for a moment to look at her, his fingers got tangled up and ended up supporting his chin. Something about his eyes made it seem like he could see right through you, and they looked too old for a genin who had just graduated a year ago. By village standards, he should still have been doing D-rank missions once or twice a month, with the occasional 2 or 3 day C-rank mission. He was supposed to spend the rest of his time training with his team and getting to know them better so they could work better together in the field. Naruto had never been normal in any way, though. Still, something about the way he looked at her made her feel uneasy. Not usually, no. She liked his eyes and how mature he was. It was a nice contrast to how she was. But today, there was something about the way he looked at her that she couldn't put her finger on. It was almost as if he was trying to figure out how valuable she was for a decision he was making. She didn't know how she would want to be judged because she didn't know what decisions he might or might not have to make. After a few seconds, which seemed like a very long time to the Tokubetsu Jounin, his voice broke the temporary silence. It had the same authoritative tone it always had. He started by saying, "Thank you for coming, Enko. I'd like to talk with you about something." She gave him a smile and said, "No problem, boss." From the way the two guards stiffened and the look of curiosity in his eyes, she could tell that they didn't really get the joke she was trying to make. Her attempt to cheer up the mood had obviously bombed, and she still felt like she should have been sent to someone's office for bad behavior. Maybe Sensei would have gone over better, since this made her think of all the times she had been called into a teacher's office when she was in the academy, and again when she was called in by her bosses as a chunin after that jerk left her. Since she became a Tokubetsu Jounin, she didn't get called in as often, but she always dreaded when she did. Ibiki had always been a hard ass. Her words, on the other hand, seemed to make Naruto stop and think about what to do next. "Of course you know I'm very involved with the wolves," he said. His guards laughed quietly at how little he said. "That's why I needed to talk to you about someone from your past." She raised an eyebrow because she didn't know who he was talking about yet. The first person she thought of was someone who had a lot to do with her past. She hoped that she could completely rule out that person. She didn't look like she had much luck. "From what I understand, you and your former teacher did not end things on a good note," he said. She laughed. At least he didn't call that jerk her master, but she wasn't happy with how things were going so far. He kept going even though she laughed. "The Snake Sennin has recently asked the wolves to work with him in Wave, and, no doubt, all over the continent in the future," he said. When he asked the real question, his eyes got very sad. "Will you be able to work with the wolves even though they will be working with people like Orochimaru? Will you be able to work with their allies, people who are loyal to Orochimaru, maybe even the Sannin themselves? Work with that jerk?" Her words were almost hissed back at her. Never. That man had ruined her life, and he had the nerve to ask if she could work with the wolves if they sided with him. Some small part of her brain remembered that the wolves protected Naruto every day, and on most of the missions they went on. But that didn't seem important at the time. "Oh, I see." He was calm and even seemed to understand, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was disappointed in her. As soon as Naruto spoke, the guards, who had been lounging on the walls, stood at attention with their eyes fixed on her. Something about this whole situation seemed to be eluding her right now, just out of reach, but the way the other 3 people in the room with her were acting made her feel uncomfortable. "Thank you for your time, Enko. Please give my regards to Kurenai the next time you see her." It was clear that he was sending her away, and a wolf was at her side in a split second to lead her out. This was nothing at all like what the wolves or her favorite genin did. He didn't look at her again as he got back to the work on his desk, but she still felt like she was being judged. Found to be lacking. "Kin, yeah, did I just see Mitarashi Enko being led out of the apartment?" As Orochimaru's former apprentice, Enko was one of the few outsiders that the people of Otagakure learned about during their training. But she had a huge grudge against Orochimaru, so it was to be expected that she would do that. Purple hair like a pineapple and only half as much clothing as you would need to be decently dressed. It's possible, huh? He knew she was from Konoha, but he hadn't expected to see her so often. It was strange enough that she was the second examiner, but why was she now in the same place where Orochimaru had left them for a month between the second and third exams? Dasu couldn't figure out why their host would have that woman over when he was working with Orochimaru and hosting 3 of her shinobi. unless he was playing both sides, that is. It was well known that Anko hated the snake Senin, so keeping them close together was just asking for trouble. On the other hand, maybe that's why she was just let out. He pushed the thought out of his mind for now and went back to looking for the kitchens. He was used to rations well enough that food wasn't much of an issue, but he'd kill for a nice cup of tea after that stupid exam. Zaku had, as expected, passed out on the bed that had been given to him. He hadn't even changed his clothes or cleaned up first. As usual, Kin was just following behind him. She was really his favorite worker. Even so, that didn't mean much since he only had two and one of them was Zaku. Even the fat Konoha genin who got his behind handed to him by the Konoha girl with the chakra chains probably would have been a better minion than the stupid hothead he was paired with. Almost making up for it was having Kin as his other teammate. But not quite. Following the hallways back towards the front of the apartment, where he thought he had seen kitchen appliances, he was able to find the room he was looking for. The layout of this apartment was very strange, almost like it was made up of two apartments that were never meant to be together. One lone wolf was leaning against the far wall next to the kitchen window. Its head was only slightly turned to watch them come in. Dasu thought that the fact that they didn't stop him from going in was a sign that at least they weren't not allowed to go in. Whether or not their host wanted them here was a different story, but at least the guards hadn't been told to stop them. Which was good because Dasu wanted his tea almost as much as he wanted a nap. Both of those things were wanted almost as much as slapping Zaku for how he had been acting before. If they were really lucky, their host might get as tired of the genin as the rest of his team. Someone should put the spoiled brat in his place, especially since Orochimaru was polite enough not to do it in someone else's territory. If she believed what she saw in her eyes, that was the only thing that kept her from yelling at the boy for being so rude as to fall asleep in a chair he wasn't even supposed to be in while his master was making plans for them to stay in the next room. The scary part is that Dasu thought for sure that she was more upset that their host had been disrespected than that he had not been paying attention to show her the proper respect. He still couldn't get over the fact that their host was probably younger than them, but Orochimaru was so concerned with keeping in his favor. But even with that in mind, they had been a pretty good host so far. It didn't mean much since they hadn't even spent a full day in his home. But it was better than what he had heard about other people who were liked by his master, taken away for testing 5 minutes after they arrived. No, thank you. He was fine with being shown his room, which he had to share with Zaku, and then being left on his own. Well, that's what he said, but what he really meant was that he was shown to his room and then left alone. He didn't care which way it went. He looked through the cabinets and found some tea, and a clean teapot was already on the counter ready to be used. They must have used it a lot because they didn't bother putting it in a cabinet. If the generic store brand tea was any indication, someone who used tea so often didn't seem to be a tea expert so much as someone who often had a lot of people over. Or maybe just wolves. At least the tea leaves were in a small plastic bag with a seal from Hai no Kuni, which wasn't known for making tea. This meant that it was probably a small family business that stayed in business because it was convenient, rather than in a can that said something like made with real tea country tea leaves. He'd only done that mistake once before. Not again. Never again. Dasu was happy to have some tea leaves, even if they weren't the best, so he got busy making the pot. Kin, on the other hand, set herself up at the small table. It didn't look like it could fit more than 4 people, and even then, it might be a little tight. He thought it was strange, given how many people must go through this building every day. Maybe he had a formal dining room further into the house, but he wasn't going to think about why that would be in the back instead of the kitchen and dining area that he and his family used. When he thought the tea was ready, he took a couple of cups from the cabinet, paused, and then turned to the guard, who had only moved his head since they came in. He asked the wolf a question in silence by raising the teapot and one eyebrow, which might have been bandaged. The wolf answered in silence by shaking its head no. He put the cups and teapot on the table with a shrug and poured tea for himself and his favorite minion. As he and his teammate drank tea in a stranger's house, where Orochimaru had told them to stay, he tried not to think about how strange it felt to be there. They were doing something so simple, so basic, and so common that he couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. That might have been a sign that it was time to take a break. He was thinking about what he could do, which, given his small savings, wasn't a lot. He almost didn't notice that a 4th person had joined them in the kitchen. He was glad right away that he had seen them come in, because it turned out that it was their host. He and Kin stood up, but their host waved them away quickly in a way that was somewhere between lazy and distracted. Dasu thought that their host might not have even noticed that he had stood up. He had to wonder how many times you had to stop people from standing up when you came up behind them until it became second nature to stop them before they could. Their host, he should really start calling them Naruto, at least in his head, opened one of the cabinets and, a few seconds later, was sitting between him and Kin at the table. Dasu couldn't help but notice that the guard moved right away to stand in front of the window his own master was facing instead of next to it, where he had been for several minutes. He thought that the idea was that any attack on their host would hit the wolf first. Dasu had a feeling that the guard would rather keep Naruto in a room with no windows, but they would make do until they could persuade the young man with red hair to move. Naruto poured himself a cup of tea, and as the liquid went into the cup, he raised one brow. Stopping short, he gave it a sniff while his eyes got wider and his mouth opened wider. Dasu thought for a moment that their host might be worried about poison. It would be just his luck to end up with someone Orochimaru likes who isn't a psychopath, only for them to be very paranoid and violent when they felt threatened. That idea was quickly put to rest when Naruto took a small drink. From the disgusted look on his face, I could tell he wasn't impressed. Their host went back into the kitchen to get his own cup and the whole pot. Without being asked, the wolf got up from his spot blocking the window and took both his and his favorite minion's cups. He didn't pay attention to Kin's confused look and instead turned in his chair to watch their host and the wolf work. The masked agent started by pouring out the tea that Dasu had just made. Then he washed the teapot carefully, and then he washed the cups quickly. As soon as the teapot was done, Naruto started making tea for himself. Dasu had spoken too soon earlier. Now things were getting strange. Their host, who Orochimaru had forced them to stay with, was, well, hosting. It should say a lot about the other people Orochimaru chose to leave his subordinates with, but since this was normal for Otogakura's shinobi, it only said good things about Orochimaru's favorite. Not only that, but whatever Dasu was able to make wasn't there for the guests, because the host was still pulling tea leaves out of a dark red tin to make his own tea. Only because their host took the tea away did Dasu think that the tea he made wasn't good enough for anyone, not just their host. If Naruto had just needed a better cup, he thought they would have left him with the tea they had already made and Naruto would have made more for himself. Even if he misread it, it looked like there was better tea in the house, and he and Kin might be able to get some. He was ready to settle for his own weak beer as the best he could get, so this was turning out to be a pleasant surprise, something that was true about both the tea and the person making it for them. If this was how things were always around here, he would be happy to do anything Orochimaru needed in Konoha so he could stay here with the most pleasant of her allies. Before long, their host had finished their job and was back at the table. Their guard went back to his spot in front of the window. Before their host poured his own cup, the first cup went to Kin, then to him, and then to the guard. Even though they were served first, none of the other three moved to take a sip until Naruto did. As Naruto sat back in his own chair, Dasu took a sip from his cup and could tell right away that the quality was different. Oh, yes, this was a big improvement. If things kept going this way, he thought he would enjoy his time here. If Kin's happy surprise was any indication, his favorite minion would also be happy. He was happy with his orders for the first time since he became a shinobi of Otogakura under Orochimaru of the Sand and Dasu. He might not have enough money to go on vacation, but this will do. Jiraiya groaned as he forced his body off the hard ground. His neck cracked and his back popped. He thought it had been a little more understanding than the women he had upset, but that didn't mean much. He knew that the girl, whose voice had caused this trouble because it sounded too young to belong to a woman, was still standing there, waiting for him to notice her. He could tell by the way she tapped her foot impatiently on the ground that her arms were folded in front of her, and that she was probably scowling at him like Tsunade did all those years ago. He got down on his knees and looked at the person who had told on him, only to see more orange than anyone should ever wear. The girl with the bluest eyes he had seen since Minato was wearing an orange skirt, orange top, and orange sandals. Even her hair was the same, and the fact that he could feel chakra coming from her made it clear who she was. There was only one clan whose kids had that much chakra, after all. "My, Naruto, is that any way to greet your godfather after all these years?" he asked as he stood up. Gods, she was short, or maybe he'd just grown taller in the last 10 years. You would have to find a few more genin to compare them to. Can't an old man even get a hug? She looked at him from head to toe. "You're Jiraiya." Well, she didn't have to act so upset about it. He was briefly tempted to do his introduction routine, but he was able to resist. "Yeah, kid, my name is Jiraiya. Don't tell me you thought I'd be taller," he said, because he really was tall. Damn tall, even more so than this squirt. He gave her a blank look when she said, "I didn't think you'd be so old. I'm an S-rank shinobi who could kick a team of Jounin to Iwa and back before lunch and who was practically a father to the Yondaime Hokage. I may be old enough to have a genin grandchild, but don't doubt for a second that I'm still in my prime. He crossed his arms over his broad chest as he looked down at his godchild for the first time in a little over a decade. She had changed a lot in that time, but she was still so small, at least compared to him. When Kushina made him hold her, he no longer had to worry about crushing her in his hands. Not that something like that was likely to happen now. The blonde made an angry noise. Whatever, I guess I haven't met you yet because you've been peeking through fences for the past few years. No, I've been peeking through everything. That's my job. This is true in more ways than one. And I think I heard that someone has been traveling around the world for the past few years. She looked embarrassed when you told her that. Her cheeks turned red and she nervously scratched the back of her head. She said, well, yeah. The look of shame turned into something more accusing. But we were gone for only a few years, and I don't think I saw you before we left. He had to scratch the back of his own head. I guess you're right. Like I said, I was working. And even though I tried to find you when I had some free time, work always called me back. Huh? You tried to meet up with us? She looked surprised, and Juria's face was so close to pouting that it was funny. Of course I did. He was angry at the idea that he might not have tried to meet his godchild and the woman who had married a boy he thought of as a son. When she heard that, she said, aw. She looked a little embarrassed, and Juria let out a sigh. Come on, kid. Let's go see your family. It's about time we all got to know each other again. As he said this, he reached down and wrapped his big hands around her waist, pulling her up onto one of his big shoulders. Because of this, he couldn't miss the way she tensed up when he brought up meeting the family. He asked, something wrong? Kayoufu, how much have you heard about Konoha in the last 4 years? Juria didn't like the way that sounded at all. Thank you for your patience. The voice was young, much younger than Ao had expected, and the speaker's face was hidden behind the face of a growling wolf. The girl was definitely a girl, and she was probably only in her mid-teens. Even so, she walked into the room with complete confidence, as if she had done this many times before. The other wolves, who seemed to be much older than she was, did nothing to stop or slow her down. In fact, they seemed to straighten up as she got closer and move closer to the walls to give her all the space she would need to pass, which, to be honest, wasn't much, and there wasn't a good reason for them to move, but the way she moved showed that she was in charge. She was supposed to be here, no matter how young she was, and the fact that this meeting was about getting support for a war gave the young woman in front of him a lot more weight than she would have in his day. It's fine. Back in my day, we would have gone to the capital to ask for an audience, but Mei was adamant that I come straight to you. She sounds very direct. Behind the mask, he could hear a smile. Tsukiyomi-sama would like that. He stays in the shadows, but he likes to get to the point quickly. Still, it's rude to show up without warning, especially when we need help. And that's why they have us, right? She sat down across from him at the table and set down some folders, a pad of paper, and a pen she found in her clothes. With a click of her pen, she asked, so, tell me about the situation in Kiri. So he did it. But he couldn't get rid of the feeling that Zabuza might have been right about these wolves more than was good for the resistance. Even though the wolves' eyes were mostly covered, he could have sworn he could feel their hunger as he told them about their situation. He only hoped that Yagura would be the flock they would eat this time, since they couldn't take on any more enemies. When a young woman wearing a wolf mask and carrying a bunch of folders walked in, the host quickly excused himself and led her to his office. Kin wasn't too surprised when the wolf who had been blocking the window moved to follow them and stood against the closed office door to protect their privacy. She gave her team leader a quick look, and they both agreed to leave it alone without saying anything. It was none of their business, and they were sure that if Orochimaru wanted them to spy on their host, someone who was very important to her, the Snake Sannin would have told them. Since she didn't, they didn't want to risk making the wolves, their host, and Orochimaru angry by asking about her personal life. The third person on their team came out of his own room at that time and sat down at the table where their host had just been. He didn't seem to notice at all, and as he poured more tea into their host's half-full cup, they looked at each other and were glad he hadn't been there when their host was there. Kin thought for a short time about whether or not Zaku should try to get into their host's private study. She really needed to start thinking of him by his name or at least by some sort of title. If they were really lucky, Zaku would be kicked out, and she and Dasu could spend a month relaxing at Naruto's house without having to worry about the fool doing something stupid. Then again, Zaku was bad enough that it could make Naruto so mad that he would also be mad at her and Dasu. So, if they lived long enough, they would also be on the wrong side of Orochimaru's anger. It wasn't good to be there. She noticed that Dasu looked back and forth between Zaku and the door in the distance before shaking his head to himself. He was probably thinking the same thing. It was too bad that a team needed 3 people and that Otagakure didn't have many shinobi. She knew it would be easy to get Dasu to help her get rid of the body if there were ready replacements. Then again, the way Orochimaru had looked at him before she left, Kin didn't even want to think about what she was going to do. It was likely that the Snake Sage would be happy to replace him if that was an option. As a thought came to her, she looked at the guard at Naruto's door and then back at Dasu. There seems to be a wide range of wolves, don't they, Dasu? HM. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye as he thought about what she had asked. I suppose that they do. She hummed a little, which was more of a way to get the attention of her team leader than a habit. You don't think that with Orochimaru's help we might be able to borrow one, do you? She asked their third teammate, who had no idea what they were talking about because he wasn't interested in the topic. Dasu seemed to perk up a bit when she said that, and he looked between Zaku and the wolf standing guard and thought, oh, maybe. For how long did you think you might need one? Oh, well, if things go well, maybe 6 months or so. He agreed with a grunt, and his eyes twinkled with approval as he laughed at her idea. The fact that Chunin exams were held twice a year and he got into the last part of this one was a bit of a fluke. Having a wolf for that long would be just long enough for them to move up from genin to full-fledged shinobi, and be able to work for anyone else they wanted. Do you think they'd do it? It wouldn't hurt to try, but if you're going to ask, I'd butter him up as much as I could. With that, he went back to his tea. She could still see in his eyes that he was having fun. With a pointed look at Zaku, Kin agreed, keep him away. I might be able to set something up. He smiled at his drink. Deal, really? He couldn't be sure. They're coming toward us. Mai nodded to show that she agreed. Yes, she said, with a small frown on her face. He even said that Zabuza was a member of the group and had argued strongly against it. And they still want our help? He asked, shaking his head and looking out a window that his office in the den didn't have. I don't like it. How bad is the situation? If they don't listen to advice from someone like Mamachi Zabuza, things can't be going well for them. Her frown got worse. That's strange. According to what he said, they're in a pretty even deadlock with Yagura's regime right now. They know they don't have much time before that changes because the Mizukage has more resources and will be able to gain the upper hand once he commits more to the bloodline war. For now, he's using the deadlock to slow down the rebellion while he and his village recover. So, he said to explain, not bad right now, but it will be. You're right. Naruto sighed and turned away from the window. He sat down and put his thumb and middle finger on his temples. I still don't understand why they want to come to us. His hand fell on his desk, right next to the many folders Mai had brought with her. Right now, they don't have much to offer us. They know, or at least Zabuza does, that we look out for our own interests. They have time to find support from other groups, and we would be up against not only an entire village, but also the rightful Kage. As long as their daimyo hasn't spoken out against Yagura and his regime, I'd be in a pretty awkward position as the daimyo of Nami no Kuni. I totally agree, everything is going against us. Naruto gave a head shake. No, he disagreed. Nope, not all of it, he said after a long pause. Only the rebel side of the story. So you propose. She didn't want to guess, but she knew exactly where he was going with his thoughts. Send an envoy to Yagura to check out the situation and see if it matches what we know. If it does, offer him our help. If the rebellion is right and Yagura is looking for a boost to his strength before continuing his bloodline civil war, he may have just found it. Yes, of course. Should I let the fire daimyo know? No, I'll tell him in person about my plans during the third exam. Genin Naruto isn't going, is he? At the moment, there was no benefit to revealing who he was, so it would stay a secret until there was. Still, she would have liked to see him go somewhere else besides work. Don't worry, I'll be with the other nobles. If you have time, send a message to Hana. As Nami no Kuni's governor, I'd like to introduce them. I'll come up with something to hide her identity. Anything else? That's all for now, Mai, he said. Okay, I'll take care of it right away. Tsukiyomi-sama, she said with a short bow. She turned to leave, but stopped when she heard her lord's voice. Oh, and Mai. She turned to face him, and just one of her eyebrows went up. Yes, thank you, and let me know if you need a break. I don't want to work you to death. She almost laughed. He was the kind of person who would be run into the ground. Since he became daimyo, he didn't show up as Genin Naruto as much, and he spent more and more time locked away in his study going through endless piles of paperwork. When he started getting more done, she stopped taking on so much of his work, and as time went on, she started giving him some of her own. She was starting to feel bad about that. Aside from his guard, not many people saw him these days, and he had pretty much given up on his dream of becoming a shinobi so he could focus on his wolves. The biggest problem with that, which she could see now, was that the wolves as a whole didn't have a clear goal, so he had nothing to work toward. So, instead, he just kept working. He did have short-term goals, but he kept finding more and more. By giving him more work, they made him think there was a lot more that needed to be done to help the wolves. Yes, it was admirable, but it didn't help him as a person. The worst part was that now that he knew his job required more work, even if she stopped sending him work, he would just give himself more to do so he wouldn't feel like he wasn't doing his job. Even though she liked being able to go to Tsum now that she had more free time. Tsukuyomi no, Naruto was much more important to her. She wanted more for him, even though he seemed, if not happy, at least happy with the arrangement that let him take care of his kids. They were supposed to take care of and provide for him. He was the one who gave them a reason to live again. The weight of his job hung heavy around his neck, and she was determined to find a way to get rid of it so he could be Naruto again, the young man they had all sworn to serve. She did not say what she was thinking, though. Of course, Naruto-sama, I'll let you know if it gets too much for me to handle. She bowed again and spoke before leaving. You haven't seen Yugao-san in a while, have you? You should pay her a visit soon. A friendly sparring match would probably do you good. He gave her a soft smile when she said that. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. You're right, that does sound nice. I'll see if I can sneak away for a few hours soon. It beat having nothing. She smiled back at him and quickly bowed again before knocking on the door to let him know she was leaving. She put her mask back on her face with practiced ease as the wooden barrier that had given them privacy moved away. She had to think of a way to help her lord, and if she was lucky, it would be something she could do before the invasion. Tsum might have some good ideas. The TV was on again, and some stupid game show was on. Anko didn't even try hard enough to figure out what the cheering was about. People thought she only had one jacket, but she actually had more than one. Her favorite one had an extra pocket and a place to put a kunai on each side. It was thrown carelessly across the couch, and her bare feet worked hard to make a groove in her hardwood floors. Something about her meeting Naruto kept bugging her, calling her attention to something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Even though he shouldn't have asked if she could work with Orochimaru after what that jerk had done to her, he did. And she got the feeling that he was disappointed with her answer. At least he didn't try to hide what he was doing. Even though she was angry that he had asked her, she was a little less angry when he didn't try to hide it. She knew that if she had found out on her own, she would have been much more upset. Still, why did he need to work with Orochimaru? And what did that have to do with her? She didn't know what the wolves were, to be honest. Yes, they were Naruto's private army, but that seemed to be all they did. Naruto seemed more concerned with making sure they were safe than working toward any goal she could think of. This made it even stranger that he would think about working with Orochimaru when he already had her. The wolves, led by Tsukuyomi, were the ones who were working with Orochimaru, not Naruto. He did what he thought was best for the people he was in charge of, so she couldn't really blame him. But what did the wolves who were working with them have to do with her? Yes, they often came with her and Naruto on missions, but she didn't really think of them as people she worked with. In that case, they would just have to avoid taking any of his guards with them. Even if that meant they couldn't go on missions together anymore, she could still hang out in his apartment and they could still spar occasionally. She briefly thought about files and folders that were kept out of sight. Already, information about the wolves was kept secret, but now it would also cover information about the Snake Sannin. When she left, there was also a team in his apartment. Foreigners. Were they part of Orochimaru's group? And if that was the case, did that mean there might be other people in the apartment who still liked her old teacher? She felt a little pain when she thought about the wolves who helped her leave. Before he told them to, they tensed up, and when he did, they moved quickly to make sure she left. It seemed like she could no longer stay in the apartment, but she still didn't understand why that would be considered working with the wolves. Except if it wasn't. The truth hit her like a bolt of lightning, and she cursed herself for not having seen it before. It wasn't about how they worked together now. Naruto wanted her to work with his wolves, so he asked if she could work with Orochimaru. She had been offered a position closer to him. She wasn't sure if that meant he wanted her to join the wolves or if he was just saying that he needed her help. She had some ideas about what his role was in the wolves, but she wasn't sure, and she had said no. Anko gave a deep groan as she gave up on her task of wearing down the floors and instead fell on her couch without any bones. Oh well, no wonder he seemed disappointed. Naruto groaned as he fell down in the grass. The sun was just starting to touch Konoha's gate, and a soft breeze was kind enough to cool him as it went by. He said, "I know it's been a while since our last fight, but I didn't expect to be that out of shape." She laughed quietly at that and then sat down next to him on the grass. She said, "You should have. Do you even train regularly anymore?" "Don't have the time," Naruto said. He didn't have to look at her face to know that Yugao had raised one eyebrow in question. "Don't have time to train. As a shinobi, training should be your life, because your life will depend on how well you've trained. He replied, other things have come up. Right now, I'm not sure I want to be a shinobi at all. What? She leaned over him, looked down at him with narrowed eyes, and asked him to explain what he meant. I chose to be a shinobi years ago, but things have changed and so have my priorities. Being a shinobi might not be the best way for me to do what I need to do. And what do you think that might be? He thought for a moment in silence before letting out a soft sigh. I can't tell you. She said, and nodded once to show she got it. The shinobi elite knew that Naruto had ties to the wolves, and it was clear that this had something to do with them. Most of the shinobi force in Konoha had their doubts, but those in charge knew for sure that if you needed the wolves, you should go to Naruto, and if you went against Naruto, you went against the wolves. No one knew how he was connected to them, but he was very important to Hai no Kuni's newest noble house. At least, he said after a few seconds of silence. Not yet. Maybe when things are less crazy. That was interesting, and it made her want to know more. Not only was it a chance to find out more, but he also said that the wolves were up to something big at the moment. They had just taken over a country and become a noble house, so what could they be doing now under everyone's noses? Then, she said, when things calmed down. Naruto gave a soft smile. Based on what she said, Anko might not have been a good choice, but she wasn't the only one he was thinking about. He was important because he was the father of the wolves, but that wasn't all he was, and he had to remember that. He had to take care of more than one group, so he needed a separate group if he was going to have any chance of making everything work. Of course, Yugao-senpai, as he waded through a sea of tall grass that came up well past his waist, which was pretty high for someone his size, with Naruto nervously sitting on his shoulder. He couldn't help but wonder what Kushina could have been doing instead of taking care of this. She always did her best to keep the house in good shape between missions and during the first few months of her pregnancy. As she got farther along, she made sure that Minato did the work until she was happy with the results, even if she didn't want to fix up the yard when she got back, and it seems like she forgot to do so. It only took a few minutes to give a mission request to a group of poor genin and have them spend the day doing it for her. With 2 polite knocks on the door to let Naruto know he was there, he crouched down so he wouldn't hit her on the head as he walked into the house his student had bought all those years ago to start a new life with his fiancée. The inside was better taken care of than the outside, which was to be expected from Kushina, but it wasn't up to her usual standards. She didn't keep things perfectly clean by any means, but you could still tell the difference. Still, he was a spy, so details were almost as important to him as the air. Okay, Squirt, go get the others. I'm sure they both missed me, she said with a dry look and a roll of her eyes. Ka-chan might have, but I'd expect better of her. We've already established that I've never met you when I was old enough to remember you, so how could Naruto Nyai? Oh, details. Even if they don't miss me, I'm sure they'd like to see the brave Jiraiya. She rolled her eyes again, sighed, and jumped off his shoulder, waving one hand over her shoulder to show that she didn't care. Yeah, whatever, old man. I'll get Ka-chan. The good news is that there was no need. Naruko-chan, her mother called, and as she came around the back of the house, her voice got louder. Is that you? I thought I heard a man's voice. She walked into the room and saw someone she had not expected to see. He was gone from the village so often that she hadn't thought about him in a long time. Hey, Kushina, Jiraiya said with a smile. It's been a while. Me miss. The way she looked was just like her daughter's. I see you haven't changed. Ero Jiji. Her ex-husband, God rest his soul, may have seen the man as a father figure, but she had always thought of him as a perverted grandfather because of his hair and bad manners. The fact that it always made her ex-husband mad was just a bonus. Of course not, he protested, puffing out his chest. I'm as amazing as ever. Kushina put her arms across her chest and gave the smallest of smiles. So it's still very bad, then. Ouch, Jiraiya said, putting his hand on his chest. Your tongue is as sharp as ever, Kushina. I'll never figure out why you treat me so badly. Because you need someone to tell you that you're not nearly as good as you think you are. He thought about it for a moment, then shook his head and said, fine. Where is Naruto, then? Like her daughter, Kushina tensed up as soon as the third family member was brought up. What have you heard about Konoha since you left? That was the second time someone had asked him the same question, and he didn't like it any better the second time. Really, almost nothing. My job is to bring information from outside Konoha. If I spend too much time on Konoha's problems, I might miss other important things happening in the elemental nations. I did hear about the new noble house in Hai no Kuni, though. They live in this area of Konoha, don't they? Both Uzumaki women hurt themselves. Jiraiya had to fold his arms over his chest next. Alright, what did I forget? Come, let's go into the living room, Kushina said without waiting for a response. Naruto followed her out of the room, and Jiraiya had no choice but to follow them and sit on one of the couches. Naruto and Kushina were sitting on the other couch, and in a different situation, they might have found it funny that Jiraiya's large size took up almost half of the couch. Kushina was quiet for a few moments while she thought about what to say. 4 years ago, a medic nin told us that because Naruto was born inside a Jinchuriki, he had a higher chance of becoming dependent on chakra. Naruto wouldn't have to worry about it because she was holding the Kyuubi's chakra in her own seal. But Naruto didn't have that advantage because his seal was only one wall of the cage. Being around the Kyuubi's chakra could disrupt Naruto's developing chakra system and make it almost impossible for him to ever leave the presence of Naruto or myself, since my chakra system still has traces of the Kyuubi's own chakra. She looked at him to make sure he was paying attention. He gave her a frown and a nod, which told her he had heard her and was probably already putting things together. The first thing I did was call Tsunade, and she agreed to come back to Konoha to check it out. However, we had been told that if he hadn't already, he could develop a dependency at any time. We had no choice but to try to keep him as safe as possible. It made sense. You left him behind, didn't you? Why have I never heard of a young boy traveling with you over the years? He asked. His tone wasn't accusatory. He was just making sure he understood the situation correctly. Too often, people thought Jiraiya was completely immature and forgot that he was an extremely skilled shinobi, a master spy, and had seal knowledge that was surpassed by only one other non-Uzumaki in history, the Yondaime Hokage. We did. Kushina nodded, but she hung her head in shame. Tsunade was supposed to show up on the first day of the academy, but she wouldn't make the official call for a few months. Naruto would be gone all day at the academy, so we could move away from him before he realized we were gone. He would never have let us leave otherwise, and I don't think I could have. Sounds good to me, he said as he moved a little bit in his seat. So, what went wrong? A couple of things, she said, her head still down. First, I had reset the compound wards so that only Naruto and I would be able to use them. I wanted to make sure he was completely safe while we were gone, but I got sidetracked and didn't finish. Jiraiya winced and said, "Oh, that hurt. That must have caused some trouble." I left a letter on the kitchen table that explained everything, but he couldn't get to it. It also meant that he had no idea where he was going. After I realized I had forgotten to add him, I thought he might have gone to Kurenai, but Naruto said they don't seem to get along as well as I thought they did. But Tsunade and Hiruzen were here, so I wasn't too worried about him not having a place to stay. And there were other problems, too. They did. She nodded again without opening her eyes. Tsunade was late, and as I said, we needed some space before Naruto could leave the academy. We didn't want him to try to come home for lunch and find that we had already left, so we left before she got there. She didn't get here for weeks, by which time he was locked out of the compound. He had no idea she was supposed to test him, and she never went looking for him. The tears that had been building up in her eyes started to slowly run down her face. It's been 4 years. We waited 4 years, until his chakra system was fully developed, to make sure we didn't hurt him. We didn't know it was safe to come back, so we waited. We were gone when he needed us. I didn't even want to write to him because I knew I couldn't say no if he asked me to come home, even if we weren't moving. I've come to realize that my worst mistake was trying not to go back. I thought that while I was gone, someone else would make sure everything was okay, but I should have come back as soon as I realized something was wrong. After she was done, Jiraiya was quiet for a minute as he thought about what she had said. Finally, he sighed, shook his head, and got off the couch. Again, most of what you did seems fine, but a few mistakes were all it took for everything to go wrong. I'm guessing that's why he's not here right now, so it won't be easy to get back into his life. But as long as the three of you are still alive, there's still a chance. You just have to keep working towards it. Between now and then, I'd like to go see him. Can you tell me where to find him? The Old Oak Apartments are close to the market area. His words weren't very inspiring, but they did make her feel a little better that things could still be fixed. She gave him a sad smile and asked, "Please, if you can, let us know how he's doing, and if you can, let him know we miss him. I won't promise anything, Kushina, but I'll see how things go. Thank you, Jiji." He smiled at us in a funny way. It's not for nothing that they call me the brave Jiraiya.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, we weeb offline.